Welcome back, action takers. Today we're joined by Jeremy Enns. Jeremy is the founder of Podcast Marketing Academy and the Counterweight Creative. And much like myself, he runs a podcast launch and growth agency. So Jeremy's been in the industry for a hot minute, super smart. Some really great tactics are discussed here today, and not so much on how to grow your actual podcast, but how to leverage the podcast to grow your business, how to charge more for your clients, and how to differentiate yourself, because I think this is the most important thing that we're not doing. It's finding ways to differentiate ourselves. So we're going to talk about A, why that's important, and B, how you can start differentiating yourself today. Super practical. Listen up. By the way, if you have not yet, you got to hit the subscribe button, leave a 5-star review. It would mean so much to me. Muchas gracias. It also shares this out with more people, allows me to give you more time. And listen, that's what we're here to do. Give you better content, less time. Let's get into this episode with Jeremy Enns. Get ready to grow your business and your podcast the right way. Let's get after it. Yo, Jeremy, what's up? Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, you too. Loved your talk at Podmatch. I thought you were awesome and off the heezy for sheezy, you might say. I'm glad to have you here in the house to share some of the love and kind of spread some of that podcasting knowledge, bro. So you ready to get into it?
I am certainly ready to get into it. Always ready to get into it when it comes to podcast marketing.
Yeah, right. Born ready. And two beards definitely thinking alike here in the house. Yeah. So Jeremy, I want to kind of go back to the past a little bit and talk to me a little bit about your starting in podcasting. How did you get started in the podcast industry?
Yeah, so I came in through the technical side. I went to school for audio engineering and wanted to work in the record industry and, work with bands, make music, all that kind of fun stuff. And so ended up going to school for that and graduated, started interning at a studio just a couple days a week at the start. It was an unpaid internship, but with those jobs, it's kind of an old school industry still in many ways. And kind of, I think unpaid internships are actually technically illegal in Canada where I'm from, or at least in the province, but they still persist in the record industry. And so you're there, you essentially show up at maybe 8 a.m. and you're there till whenever the sessions end for the day. You're like the first one in, last one out. And so a lot of times that's like 4 a.m. or something like that. When recording wraps up, everybody goes home, you clean up and you leave. And so, doing that one day a week, that's, maybe manageable in order to learn the skills. I was learning a lot, getting to meet people, all that kind of stuff. But the people who were moving up the ranks of interns into paid positions were literally there doing that kind of routine 7 days a week. And I knew people who were living in their cars, and I had a full-time job and was like, okay, I can't afford to, live and survive while, making that kind of sacrifice. And so I kind of did that for a year, just once or twice a week. I did learn a lot, but eventually was like, okay, this is not the path for me. This is not the life that I want to have. And so I kind of got out of that entirely. Just worked a bunch of landscaping, manual labor, construction jobs, saved up, and then took a year off to go traveling. And in that year traveling, as happens to many people, you kind of get the bug. I'd already probably had the travel bug, but this was the first big trip, and I kind of came back and was like, how can I do this all the time? How can I make this my life? And this was obviously, a number of years before where we are today, where remote work has become the norm. This was back in 2014. And so I got back from that trip and kind of discovered podcasting and online business simultaneously. I had heard about podcasts before that. And I, came home from work one day and was like, I wonder if there's anything out there on making a business. I don't even know what to search for, but I opened up, it was iTunes at the time. And I think I searched creative business or something like that. And of course, dozens of shows start showing up. And I basically spent the next year, went back to a landscaping job that I could listen to stuff at work. And I listened to probably 40 to 50 hours of podcasts on online business and marketing a week at 1.5, 2 times speed, and basically gave myself this education in business, and kind of realized at some point along there that, all these skills that I have around audio engineering transition perfectly over into podcasting. And so at some point, and it was about 6 months after getting into podcasting as a listener, I realized this could work for me. And I think it was basically within 3 days, I got my first client after making that realization. And within 6 months was making more from podcast editing than I was for my day job. So kind of quit and was on a flight to the UK at that point. That was my first stop 2 weeks later. So kind of I've been doing the traveling and the business thing simultaneously for the past 6 years now.
Super cool. Super cool that you fell into it. Good on you to actually, figure out where you wanted to be and try to develop the systems in the business to achieve that freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that people are working for free 7 days a week, you know, that model is dead, right? Like there's no reason why you should be giving away all of your valuable stuff for free. Do you think, or do you think it is a good idea to give some of your best stuff away for free on the front end while you're learning?
I mean, it is interesting. Like there are things from like working in a recording studio, like you can't learn that any other way. Like I think for working in a big like world-class studio, and like this was a studio where it was under different ownership now, but like Metallica and Aerosmith and AC/DC, and like in the 80s it was like one of the go-to studios in the world for a certain genre of music. And so the type of like top end talent, like the producers and engineers who were working on all that stuff, you know, platinum selling records and Grammy nominated and winning, like you can't get that for that's what you're I guess buying with your time and your sacrifice is access to those types of people and learning from like the best of the best. And so I think in that regard, like I did learn so much from doing that. And at some point I realized like, okay, is this actually the life I want? And it really wasn't. And looking back, it's really interesting. Like most of the people that I went to audio school with aren't working in audio anymore. And the few who are the ones who've had an easier time have gone into like film and television kind of sound production. Whereas the people who are still chasing the music thing, like a lot of them are still working, you know, 10 years later, still working part-time jobs to support the music thing. And like, they love what they do. And for me, I realized like, I love music, but I don't love it that much to make that kind of sacrifice. And so I'm very happy with the path I took. And I mean, I think there is value in kind of making those short-term sacrifices. It did help me level up in a lot of ways and give me a lot of confidence that I even took into podcasting, which is kind of interesting that ported over. But yeah, I think it is interesting. At some point, you do have to ask yourself, like, what's the value of my time? And is this the best use of it? And yeah, for a time it was. And then for a time, I kind of reached a point where I was like, no, this isn't actually the best use of my time anymore.
Definitely good question. All the after hours entrepreneurs out there understand that we need to be asking ourselves that question, because if we're putting in that after hours effort, we want to make sure it's well met, that we're actually working towards something. I had John Lee Dumas on the show, and he had mentioned this phrase really stuck with me. It's play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Yeah.
You know, it just made so much sense to me. Like, you know, try to envision where you want to go and then reverse engineer that so you can take the steps to get there. When you started in your audio editing journey, how hard was it to scale? Because that's a very labor intensive job. I've spent thousands of hours in my dark, dank room editing. Thank God I have an amazing team behind me now that puts me to shame. But what challenges did you find as you were scaling out of your manual labor, your personal service, into actually outsourcing and bringing on team members?
Yeah, so actually getting the initial clients, that came pretty easily in those 6 months. Like, I don't think I've ever had so I was going to say I've never had a growth period in terms of number of clients like those first 6 months. Obviously, when you're starting from zero, it's a lot easier to kind of ramp that up to, you know, whatever your sustainable income is. But part of that is like, I was super undervaluing myself at the time, as, you know, everybody does when they first start out. And I was kind of like actually aware of that. And this was another trade-off where I was like, I have a full-time income. I don't need this to make money. I need this to get clients, to build up my network, to be able to get testimonials. And so really I started low. I think I started at like $15 an hour or something. And then every new client, I'd up the rate by $5 an hour. And eventually I started out on Upwork, which a lot of people have a lot of negative experiences with, and I had really great experiences with. And the two things that I think was eventually I was the top priced person on Upwork. So I had set my rate to like $300 an hour or something like that. And matched with that, I'd also like really infused a ton of like wacky off the wall personality into all of my copy on my page. And so I think anybody who came across me was like, whoa, this stands out. And what, $300 an hour? What's going on here? And so I think there was immediately this bit of like curiosity of like, okay, you've got thousands of people at $10 an hour who are all sending the exact same intro messages and all this kind of stuff. And then you've got one person at $300 an hour who has this whole like personality and this stuff that is like, there's almost maybe like a swagger to it kind of. And that's one of the things that was really interesting to me is like, I came in from audio engineering and I was like, okay, I know more than almost any podcast editor on Upwork here about technical audio engineering. Like I've worked in, you know, multi-million dollar studios and like all of this stuff with hundreds of tracks on recordings. It's like, I know what I'm doing better than the average person. And so very quickly. And then I also wasn't reliant on like needing to get clients immediately. And so I was looking at this like, okay, my goal is to travel. That's what I want to do. And I don't necessarily care how long this takes. I don't need this to pay off in a month or 6 months. Like if this takes me 2 years, that's fine. Like if I'm able to build a business, then I can have this lifestyle I want for the rest of my life. If that takes 5 years, even if that takes 10 years, like that's a fairly big amount of work to put into that. But if the next 50 years after that paid off and I was able to achieve this lifestyle, I was kind of like playing the long game. And so I was like, okay, I can be patient with this. And the funny thing is that I didn't end up needing to be. And so that's kind of a mindset I kind of initially learned then, but it has been really valuable in going forward since then as well.
So I was listening to Chris Do talk about this the other day, I think in a Twitter Spaces, something along those lines. If anyone's not familiar with Chris Do, like he's an absolute genius, sensei extraordinaire. And he mentioned this idea to me, Jeremy, that you should be charging more with every single client you bring on. Because I don't know about you, but I've had times where a client will ask me or a lead will ask me, how much is the service? I tell them, I'm like, yep, snap call. And I'm like, probably could have gotten more for that, you know? But you're right. It's hard to price yourself. It's hard to price yourself correctly, especially when you're starting off, I think. You mentioned differentiation, right? So I'm thinking about the copy that you're using, the goofiness in your copy. Is that just letting your own personality come out? Because the flip side of that is, I would think that the highest payers are going to be the very businessy type of people, or did you find that wasn't the case? You weren't turning off your ideal client, or where do you fall on that? Because I feel like we oftentimes are afraid to let ourselves kind of shine and show our own uniqueness.
Yeah, I would say there's almost like this curve kind of like where there's a dip. So at first there's a certain tier of people who are going to be really attracted to that personality, who might be like solopreneurs or something like that. And they'll pay more than like the really just the budget people who are just wanting that $10 an hour person. And so that was where a lot of my initial clients come in. So they were like in that $50 to $100 an hour range where they were like really happy to hire someone that they connected with and that they shared interests with and that we had kind of shared missions. But they kind of capped out, they're not going to be paying, they just can't afford to pay much more than that. And so then I think you get into this downturn where like, yeah, maybe that next level is more corporate and where that might be like a little bit harder to kind of command that price when you're being really quirky or off the wall. And like, even with them though, I would say like, it's still always people hiring. And so a lot of times it's like a manager somewhere. And like one of my best clients was a startup, 100% personality match. Like that's why he connected with me. And it was partly there was through a referral from a friend, but like if we didn't have that personality kind of match and the quirkiness and what, like he would not have hired me. Like they were a company who was, I think, pretty forward thinking, but like they had a big budget and they wanted to work with like real people who like sounded like real people, who were unique and were not like people have a negative connotation about corporations, right? Being faceless. I think people at corporations have that same thing for a lot of the people they hire. Like they want to work with real people that they'll get along with, especially if you're thinking about them. Like podcasting, to me, it's really hard to outsource everything and be successful. Like the brand or the host always has to have something at stake, and they have to be like the show's biggest fan, I think. Like, and maybe that's not like the absolute owner of the show. So if a brand starts a podcast, maybe it's not the CEO isn't like the biggest fan of the show, but it's like the host and the team who creates the podcast. They are the biggest advocates for it and the biggest evangelists for it. And so I think when you're thinking about co-creating in this way, like you as a host or as a team who's producing the podcast, you want to work with humans who are equally excited about that as you are and who have like personality, who you're going to get along with, because you're going to be working hand in hand with these people. And so I think that like there is a bit of a trough. I think maybe that's the more forward thinking companies who do value that, certainly not all of them. But then I think it turns back up where you will never make more money as a business owner or a service provider or a freelancer, whatever it is, than if you're able to build a name for yourself as like the one person who is the most in demand. Like there is only one of you and you can charge whatever you want because you are so highly acclaimed in your field. And so obviously that's not something that happens in the first 5 years of your business, and maybe not even the first 10 years. Maybe that takes you like 20 years. Maybe you've like written multiple books at that point and you're like, there's only one. Like for me, my biggest influence is always Seth Godin. Like there is no other Seth Godin in the world. Or you look at like James Clear or Simon Sinek or like Amy Porterfield or Marie Forleo or like any of these huge people in business. There's no substitute for those people. And so it's about like, how do you become that person? And then that's when you can charge way more. Like you can charge essentially whatever you want, and there's going to be somebody who's going to pay that.
Yeah. So I love this topic. I was actually at PodFest this past weekend, and everybody there has a podcast launch agency, podcast production agency. Not literal everybody, but literal everybody, basically. Awesome conference, by the way. If you're into podcasting, you consider it's a great place to go. Really rub shoulders with some of the best. To your point, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, what makes Mark Savant Media? What makes my business different from all these other businesses? And I agree with you. You know, in a lot of cases, it needs to be us as the founders, right? You know, I'm just thinking, but what makes us different? You know, I could simply say, oh, well, I'm Mark Savant, I'm different. You're Jeremy Enns, you're different. Like, but how much do we want to hang on to that? What has been your experience?
Yeah, so this is actually interesting. And so I've kind of gone, and I think a lot of people go this way. When you first start out, you try and act bigger than you are. And so you say we on all your website copy when it's really only you. And you try to like seem like this bigger agency, and like maybe there's value to that, maybe there's not. And it's funny, like I went into that and then I came out the other side and I was like, actually, no, like it needs people. The thing that people, you know, like is me a lot of times, and that they resonate with and relate to. And especially if you're creating content, like content works way better when you are, you know, a person who's writing it, who people can relate to, and you can share more of your like personal experiences and emotions and all of that kind of stuff. And so because one of the big things I was doing, I'd probably written like 150 blog posts for our agency or like on podcast related stuff. Like I was kind of like, people are getting to know me through that content. So I think that needs to come through in other places as well. So I actually went back to using like I and Jeremy instead of like this more kind of vague me. And it's interesting. Like on the one hand, the advice, like if you're looking to sell a business, and I didn't start out with the idea or the intention of selling my agency, but always like went in with the approach that like, okay, I'm building this in a way that I could sell it in the future. And so obviously if you are the person who is necessary to run the business, that's going to devalue the business if you want to go to sell and you're leaving. And so like, you kind of do have to keep that in mind. And so like, structurally and through the systems like that, none of that relies on me. But from a marketing perspective, like right now, a lot of it does. But at the same time, like I am moving pretty quickly and away from the agency. And because one of those things that like that question that you asked, like what differentiates Counterweight Creative from all the other, like when I started, there was maybe like 10 podcast production agencies, and now there's, you know, dozens. And I couldn't answer that question. I was like, I have no good answer to this. And I realized like, I don't want to have an answer to this. Like this, the thing that for me that I'm going to create that is going to be different and unique has nothing to do with implementation and podcast editing. It's going to be about ideas and thinking and marketing and coming up with stuff that people haven't connected the dots with before. And so really like it was once I kind of got onto this marketing and education side of things and more of the like writing and content creation, I was like, this is where I have something that like to say that nobody else can offer. And like nobody's brain works the same way I do. Nobody has the same influences that I do. And so the content that I can create, like there's this kind of like moat that nobody can ever like breach that, because nobody's going to be, you know, come up with the same content that I have and create the same blog posts and newsletters and all that kind of stuff. Like it's impossible. And so once I realized like, oh, this is what that kind of differentiation feels like, that like even accelerated it more, where I was like, okay, yeah, I never had that with the agency, and the tide was rising enough in the industry that it was successful and continues to be successful, but I'm not like really actively trying to market that anymore. So it's interesting. It depends kind of, I think, on what your goals are. And I think differentiation is a real accelerant in order to growth. It's not always 100% necessary, but like I caught the timing, you know, really well and was one of the earlier production agencies, and then you can kind of grow through referrals and reputation and those types of things. Whereas if you're trying to stand out in a super crowded market where there's already a ton of people doing something similar, you absolutely have to have some kind of differentiation, or you got to like, you know, market your way out of that essentially, which I know a lot of business people don't actually want to spend that much time marketing. So there's a bit of a couple of choices there.
A few good points there. I especially like the part about planning out your exit before you get started, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, one of the things I see a lot of podcasters do, or when they're promoting their show, is all they do is they post up like a little video graphic, little audiogram, maybe a photo each week, and then that's it, right? But that's boring. I don't think that people really care about that, generally speaking. At least personally, I found that once I started interjecting more of me into my social media, once I started injecting more of my mannerisms and the way that I speak, I think people get like really attracted to that. You know, it's just way more interesting to see, like, you know, to your point, what the creator is doing, because for most young businesses, most young podcasts, That's what it is. It's you, maybe an assistant, maybe you're working with a team like what Jeremy and I have going on. But I mean, just level one, it's take more selfies. I think, if you want to stand out on social, you want your show and your audience to grow, just take more selfies. That would be, a quick piece of practical advice from me. I do want to talk a little bit, Jeremy, because you've got so much experience launching shows. And one of the things that show creators obviously want to do is get their show out there, get new people listening to it as soon as possible. So I noticed on your website, you've got some interesting plans on how you execute on that. Why don't you walk me through what that looks like to you? New shows launching, creator wants to let people know, what are you having them do?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a bit interesting. So most of the people that we work with have established businesses and may have existing audience as well. And so this is actually interesting how podcasting's shifted over the past, 6 years that I've been involved with it as well. Is one of the first things on every sales call I say to everyone is like, podcasting is not an audience growth strategy. Like, you will be very disappointed if you come in and you say, I'm starting the podcast because I want to grow my audience. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, that can happen, but people are not going to organically discover your podcast. Like, it will happen a little bit here and there, but not reliably enough that you can just start creating episodes and people are going to find it. Unless maybe you are in this super underserved niche where there's really nothing available. But by this, at this point, most niches are fairly busy and there's a lot of competition. And so really for me, it starts off, and where we kind of like to work with people is, okay, you've got an existing audience, you've got attention elsewhere, but you want to nurture them more and turn them into super fans and, clients and customers into especially high ticket products and services. And so there certainly is like an element of audience growth that goes into podcasting. But for me, most of that is actually about finding attention elsewhere and then directing it back to the podcast. And so this actually ties into with a launch. And so a lot of times we are launching to at least a established audience. Maybe it's, a few thousand people, maybe it's 100,000 people, like depending on what the brand is or the person is who has that audience. So there is a range there, but I think like a lot of the stuff that goes along with a launch kind of ties back into ongoing activities as well. But I would look at like podcast guesting, submitting your show, for launch to both podcast newsletters and industry and niche newsletters, and looking at like, how can you condense all of this exposure around the launch? And so this is stuff that you're going to need to start lining up months in advance probably. And this is something that like, if you haven't done this before, it's really hard and it's really overwhelming. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, people hire, agencies like ours, is because, we've been through it before and kind of understand and can kind of even just build the roadmap for them and say like, okay, 3 months out from launch, start to like make these connections, start reaching out to people, research these newsletters, see if you can get in touch with a writer here, all this kind of stuff. And like, this sounds scary, but really like, it's just, looking at reaching out to, well, first of all, finding people who are interested in your topic and who have a stake in it and whose audience has a stake in it. And if you're creating something that's useful for that audience, there are so many like curatorial newsletters out there that are always looking for content. And these exist in every industry. And so if you're able to bring them something new and fresh and say, hey, I'm launching this thing, it's going to be coming out on, whatever date, here's the teaser for it or an intro behind the scenes look, like, do you think this is something your audience would be interested in? And if they're like, oh, this sounds amazing, like our audience would totally be into this. And then you can kind of set up this thing and say, hey, could you like put this out in your newsletter on, this date when it goes live? And they'll be happy to help you out. And maybe you even exchange, say like, I'm happy to give you a shout out in the episodes or whatever. You can have some kind of exchange going on here. But I think for launches, like so much emphasis in people's minds gets put on like hitting the charts, when really it should be on like, okay, where's the audience and where can I reach them? Because like you will go up the charts if you reach people who are relevant to your show and they listen to it. It's not like you can just like game the algorithm and all of a sudden like all your perfect people are going to find it. Like, go to the people first and the algorithm will follow and kind of pick it up from there. So when it comes to launching a new show, that's a lot of my advice. But the other thing that I just always tell people is there is nothing you can do that will make your show or break your show in the launch. Like, you don't hit the new and noteworthy charts, fine, whatever, it doesn't matter at all. You do hit the charts, great, that's amazing, but you're going to drop off them, and then you're going to need to do all the hard work to build your way back up over the next like 2-3 years. Like, that's how podcasting in any creative platform works. Like, this is not a short-term like game, that going back to that idea. And so I think like I usually tell people going in, like, don't expect this to grow your audience, and also expect that this is going to take 2 or 3 years for the results to really start paying off. Like, this is an investment you put in, and it will pay off phenomenally over time, but you're going to have to work really hard at it and be consistent with it until that.
That's interesting, because I've actually flipped my mind on this too over the past several years, and that a podcast is a really good way to serve an audience that's there, but it's not really it's not really like a top of funnel type of marketing play. It's farther down the line when someone's already aware, already seen you speak or guest on a show, something along those lines. But the other challenge I think that we have here, Jeremy, we're trying to sell our product, we're trying to sell our services, is that, most podcasts aren't getting to episode 7. You know what I mean? So how do you account for that? And I heard someone else say this the other day, that they just charge a lot of money for the launch because everybody quits their podcast anyway. So I don't care about the services on the back end. I'm thinking to myself, like, you're just taking people's money without giving them any value. Like, that sounds like a horrible business model. It's like setting someone up to fail. So like, how do you set up someone who's new to podcasting? They want to make it work. How do you set up someone for success?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, a lot of those kind of qualifiers that I said up front of, like, you weed out a lot of people who aren't in it. And so most people who end up working with us, they kind of like have zero expectations for the launch. And they're kind of like often starting from like, really, we're building this to serve our existing community first and foremost. And we know that's going to grow over time. And we understand where this fits in the funnel. So there's just kind of, the expectations are lower and they're set accordingly, that like, yeah, we're taking on a new project that we're going to be doing for the next 5 years. And we're doing it because it's fun and I get something out of it as the host. And, maybe there's also these, secondary benefits of building their network, getting connect with people, while also working on this nurture kind of sequence for their audience. And then also, some people are going to discover it as well. So there's like a lot of side benefits that I like to think about, kind of instilling in people and saying like, hey, this is going to take a while for this to really pay off, but there's all these other ways that this can pay off a lot faster. And you look at all these other ways that you can grow outside of revenue and follower count. And network, I think, is the biggest one that often actually does have these huge benefits of related to revenue and follower count. And so, you connect with someone on your show and then you end up doing some collaboration, a few weeks later or a few months later, where there's this way that you can kind of work together. It's not really tied into like your audience going through the podcast and coming into your services, but maybe you co-produce a webinar or something like that, and you both grow your audiences and maybe you make some sales off that. And like, that's actually very common in my experience when you go into it with the idea that that's an option and a possibility. And so that actually often kind of moves the needle a lot faster than the organic growth and organic kind of nurturing and turning people into clients and customers. So I think first and foremost, that's what I would say, like, set your expectations. Don't go into it if you're like, this is something that I need to work now, because it probably won't. And then besides that, I think the other thing is like, you just don't know a lot of times what's going to work and what's not going to work. And that can both be for your audience and also for you. And so I started a show in fall of 2020, and most of our clients at the time were in the wellness space, and they had been for years just through referrals. Like, I hadn't chased those clients at all, would have not have been my preferred niche. But at some point I was kind of like, okay, fine, I'll like lean into this. It seems like we could become, that could be our differentiator. We could be like the one and only, or the podcast production agency for health and wellness business owners, because they're already coming to us and we're not even leaning into it. Maybe we should do that. So I decided to create a show called Build a Better Wellness Biz for, online wellness business owners, really serving them and creating content around that. And started it, ended up doing 30 episodes before quitting it 6 months later. But, very quickly after starting it, I realized, man, this is just a slog. Like, this is not the content. I'm doing this and it's a good strategy. Like, the strategy was great and it was actually starting to pay off. Like, we did get a couple of clients or two in even that short time span, which amazed me, even with a very small listener count, and had some like great feedback from it. But I was just like, I have my newsletter that I write every week, which takes 8 to 10 hours probably to put together. And then the podcast, which took like 10 to 15 hours to put together. And I was just like, okay, I can't do both of these for one. Like, this is just way too much time on content creation for this to be worth it. But the newsletter is the thing that I just will do because I love it and it energizes me, and it's where I like develop ideas and work through them. The podcast just feels like a slog. And so I realized, like, I am not the right person to be hosting this show. This show in its current format, with its current audience, its targeting, the whole strategy, like, this all works except me. Like, I'm the odd one out here. Like, somebody else could do this show so much better, where they were the one who like found energy in it and like loved the audience and wanted to get to know everything about wellness businesses. And I was just like, nah, I'm more interested in other kinds of businesses. Like, I like the people, but it wasn't like, the topic wasn't inherently compelling to me that I just wanted to spend all my day thinking about it. And that's the experience I did have with my newsletter. And so I was like, okay, this is clearly a mismatch of like what I think of as a like creator, product, or podcast fit. So we often hear about, you know, a product market fit, but it goes the other way as well of like, are you the right person to be working on that project? And a lot of times I think this is one of the big reasons why there's this problem. I mean, I don't even want to say problem. It just exists in podcasting, and it exists in every creative medium ever, anywhere, that people start something and they're like, oh, this is more work than I thought, or actually I'm not excited about this as I thought, and so I'm not going to continue that. And I think that's actually a good thing. And like, I don't know about you, but like, I look back on my creative career, I must have started dozens and dozens and dozens of creative projects, and 95% of those have gone nowhere. And that was the right choice to leave them so that I could put that time into the next thing that might have a better chance of being the thing that was gonna, you know, actually move the needle for me. And so I think a lot of times, like, I coach podcasters, like, do a pilot or do 3 episodes or something like that. Put that out to your audience. If you don't have an audience, like, go find 10 people who should love this thing. And if you can't find anybody who gives you any kind of positive feedback on this, maybe the idea is not that great. Maybe you should try and tweak it in some way, or find a different audience, find a different idea. And like, don't set yourself up to like, I'm going to be doing this for, you know, forever right off the bat. Like, start small, test ideas, tweak them, maybe even just like create a trailer for a show that is hypothetical at this point. Put that out there, see like, does this resonate with people? Are people interested in this concept of the show? And, you know, if not, move on to something else. If they are, then say, okay, I'm going to go ahead with this and I'm going to start doing interviews, or, you know, what if maybe it's a solo show or whatever that is. So kind of like de-risking it for yourself by testing the waters first, both like, do I like this thing? Do I like creating this thing? Am I going to be able to do this for the next 3 years? And, you know, spending, you know, 10 hours a week or however long it takes. And is there actually, you know, an appetite for this out there? And if the either answer is no, then probably you have some tweaking to do, but there probably is an answer out there. There's some combination of topic and you and audience that are all going to work together.
Yeah, really well formulated, I think, synopsis there, Jeremy. Like, there's this tension too, right? You know, whatever type of business that we're trying to build and grow, like, there's going to be some components of it that we don't like doing, right? Yeah, there's going to be some stuff that's boring, that's a slog, that we don't enjoy. But we also at the same time need to have that awareness of like, you know, am I building my own prison? You know,
yeah.
is this really where I want to lean in? You know, I'm terrified of that. You know, building out a business that I just can't escape. Thankfully, I'm not that place now because I love working with new people and growing these shows. But, you know, I think we need to be real with ourselves too. By the way, did you say you spend 10 hours a week on your newsletter?
Yeah, it's something like that. It may even be a little bit more. I would say it takes probably like 6 hours of writing, maybe an hour of editing, and then there's like 3 hours kind of formatting, setting everything up. Yeah, part of it, I'm like, yeah, essentially like my newsletter is my main nurture kind of tool for my business. And so it's the thing that like I have the most fun doing. Like, all of that time is really, it's the final 3 hours of like actually setting it up in ConvertKit and doing all the formatting, finding a bunch of links. And like, there's ways I've made it harder on myself for sure. I could probably cut it down by a couple hours, and I'm kind of currently looking at that right now. But really, like, it's the ideas and the writing, that's where most of the time goes, which that's like the fun part for me. So I mean, it's also the frustrating part as writing often is, but yeah, it does take a while. But I would say that like, whatever your primary content, you know, you look at YouTube or podcasting or anything, like doing any of these things, I know people who spend like 20 or 30 hours on individual podcast episodes or YouTube videos or stuff like that. So when I'm looking at that scheme of things of like, okay, what are other people at the top of their fields putting in? I'm like, actually, maybe I should be spending more on this if I want to compete in that realm.
Well, and, you know, along this line of thought of, you know, where am I going to spend my energy and my attention? Obviously, if you love doing it, that's great. But we also need to make sure that there's some sort of return. Like, you know, how are you gauging the return on that? Are you clicking, you know, how many people are clicking the link from ConvertKit, or like, I'm just fascinated by spending so much time on your newsletter, because I'm not even in that same ballpark, right? Like, I'm less than 5 minutes on my newsletter because I try to keep it quick, snappy, just a quick heads up, you know, I just kind of want to dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah. So essentially, like, I think there's kind of split in thought, and depending on like where you come from like the world of online business or creator business or anything like this, there's kind of different worlds almost that I don't feel like they overlap that much. And so I think historically a lot of newsletters were like little roundups, like again, that like 5-10 minutes, maybe you take an hour on it per week, and it's like more of a recap or distillation of other stuff you're doing. Whereas I mean, these other types of newsletters I think have always existed, but this is mine where like it's a product, like it, not a paid product, but like you don't need an opt-in for it. The product is the newsletter. It is valuable in and of itself that you would actually want to receive this on a weekly basis. And so that's where essentially it's like a blog delivered through email. And so every new week there's an essay, and then I also curate 5 links that I found interesting that week that I think my audience of creators would find interesting. And so this is really interesting that and that you bring this up around the ROI of it. And for me, this again goes back to those secondary benefits. It's kind of interesting because my main newsletter is not about podcasting at all. All of my products and services are related to podcasting. So I actually have a second newsletter, which is podcasting focused. That's the Scrappy Podcasting newsletter. And that one is actually growing pretty quickly as well. But my main one, Creative Wayfinding, is way more about this like internal journey that we all have as creators and really people of like, okay, we have this kind of goal out there. We don't really know exactly where it is. There's no map on how to get there. And we all kind of have to navigate that path for ourselves because no one else's path. We can't like look at what somebody else has done. And, you know, if we follow that, it's just not going to work out for us. We all have our own backgrounds that are going to influence this and our own kind of individual destinations. And so that's really what this newsletter explores, is like, for creators, how do we make decisions? How do we navigate this kind of like creative wilderness to find our way to our goals when everything is just like, we feel like we're, you know, covered in fog all the time, don't have clarity, can't see where we're going. And so the funny thing about this though, is I suspect, and I've heard some kind of feedback that seems to support this, is that people come into my ecosystem for maybe a free podcasting workshop that I've done, or through, you know, my podcasting like blog. And so they come in through the podcasting front door, and then they get this other newsletter, which they're so surprised by because it's unlike any other newsletter that they get, and they don't expect it. And they're like, the feedback is just like, people are blown away. They're like, I've never like actually looked forward to an email in my inbox every week. And like, I think partly it's because it's like, there's no selling through it. It's just like a podcast. People listen to podcasts because they want to learn something, right? Or they want to connect with the host or whatever it is. That's why people read my newsletter. And so I think there's something about it that is disarming. And it wasn't in any way that I intended, but I think that people come in through this really practical, tangible, I want to learn to grow my podcast or get more sponsorships or like whatever that is. And then they get this kind of newsletter on the back end and they're like, oh, this is like really deep stuff that I like. Oh yeah, I am. This has nothing to do with podcasting, but this has 100%, you know, to do with where I am as a creator and how am I supposed to navigate all this stuff, because we're all dealing with all that kind of stuff. And so I think it kind of really bonds people to me, and they're like, whoa, Jeremy's like, he's not just this one-dimensional, like just podcasting, super focused. Like there's this whole person behind it. And one of the things, this is one of my biggest theories that seems to be proven right time and time and again, is that people develop a way higher affinity for people who they have that three-dimensional view of. And so I think there's a lot of advice around like really narrowing your messaging and your niche. And I think that's great for getting people in the door, but I think it actually harms you, I think, in terms of like building long-term affinity, and which is really important if you're looking to get people into a community or a really high ticket product or something like that. Or, you know, really like going back to that idea of like Seth Godin before, who's my idol, like being that one and only person. It's really hard to do that when you're really, really narrowly niched and there's no kind of dimensionality to you as a person in people's eyes. And so I have a really hard time tracking the ROI on this, other than anecdotally that I know most of the people who end up signing up to my program are like diehard readers of my Creative Wayfinding newsletter, which again has nothing to do with podcasting, and they'll like reference it, and like it comes up like almost every week in the community. Somebody will like talk about something in the newsletter, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, of course it applies 100% to podcasters. It's also broader, but it's about all the stuff that's like, they're not really getting that anywhere else. And so I think that's where the value is. And so I would love to be able to track it more. I haven't taken on sponsors for it yet. I've kind of thought about that at some point. That would make it easier to kind of see ROI. I more track like general, you know, what's the average annual value of a subscriber on my list in total. And I can kind of say, well, okay, the newsletter is, you know, part of the reason for that, but I can't say, you know, definitively this newsletter is worth this much per subscriber and the podcasting one is worth this much. And so it's all kind of like, there's a little bit of a shot in the dark, but I think, again, it goes back to that long-term mindset where I'm like, okay, I'm going to be like, with the Creative Wayfinding newsletter, I'm going to be writing about this stuff for probably the rest of my life. Like I see, multiple books in the future going that direction. And like, that's where I'm heading. And that's where like my ideas are kind of like come through that channel. And so I know I benefit enough from writing it, even if nobody ever read it, that I would still keep doing it anyway. And it turns out that it happens to have this other kind of hard to measure benefit as well.
It's a very interesting take, Jeremy. And, I'm a big believer in, connecting with human beings over more than just, what you do.
Yeah.
Right. I also am a big believer in making it very clear and very obvious what you do to people. Sometimes I think, as creators, we can really obfuscate and make things that we're, try to explain very difficultly in the most complicated way of what we do. Like, just being able to tell people I launch and grow podcasts, like, people get what that means. Is before it was like, well, I do this creative content marketing strategy. That gets complicated. But so I heard Gary Vaynerchuk talking about this topic where, he posts a lot about sports cards, but he ain't selling any sports cards. He's not making money on sports cards, but he connects with people via sports cards. He connects with people via his football, love for the Jets. And so I've actually started to incorporate that strategy into what I do. I'm obviously I'm big into podcasts, but I'm also big into NFTs. I have an NFT podcast, and I'm very passionate about fatherhood, and I have a parenting podcast also. It's out there, it's live, and just to your point, Jeremy, I don't really have a direct ROI.
Yeah,
I can't calculate per download of the Awesome Dad Show that's worth 10 cents towards my body. I can't calculate that. But I still feel led. I still feel like it's a really important part of what differentiates me from the market. You know what I mean?
Yep. And, on that point too, I'll add, like, I have started testing that theory much more intentionally around people connecting with these other things. And I've started thinking about it like, okay, you've got your core, whatever the primary context that you're in. So right now we're talking, to business owners. So our kind of core context is business, and maybe even podcasting is the subset. And so you've got this kind of one shared thread in common. But in my experience, the more threads you can attach to a single person that you have all these things in common, the stronger the connection is, and the more likely they're going to, take the next step with you. And the interesting thing about this is I have started. So I did a workshop a few months ago, a free workshop. And first I had my like professional about me slide. And so it was all my, industry experience, whatever. And it's kind of, maybe good for building credibility, but ultimately kind of boring. And then like the day before, an hour before the workshop, I was like, actually, I want to test this. And I put a second about me slide. So I did the serious one and the fun one. And I put like as many like quirky things about me, my like interests in like cycle touring and ultimate Frisbee and like all my travel background and like all this other stuff that was, very unique to me. And I was like, I wonder what will come of that. And I've started doing that in my newsletter too. And one of the things that I've realized is literally, like, I would say 97% of the time that somebody responds to an email from me, they compliment like the essay, but they also reference something else. And so what that says to me is like, people just need, they can like what you do. And obviously the podcasters are so familiar with like it being really hard to get feedback. And there's some bond that's created where it's like, hey, we're both into podcasting and we both play ultimate Frisbee, a pretty obscure sport. Like, I got to reach out. This is my kind of person. I got to reach out. And so I think it's about putting those, it's not making your whole content about that, but it's like being willing to put those little things out here and there, not spending a ton of time on it, but just putting it out there. And somebody's going to be like, whoa, like they're also a Star Wars nerd and they're also into cycle touring and we're also both into podcasting. Like, this is my new best friend. And it is amazing when you start doing that, like people start reaching out way more and you develop these like really in-depth relationships because you have these like multiple shared contexts now. And there's all, again, it goes back to this kind of dimensionality of not just you, but the relationship that you now have that, like, hey, we could talk about podcasting or we could talk about this or we could talk about this. Like, I feel like there's lots of, kind of soil to plant the seed of a relationship in there. And so that's one of the things that I like used to be, again, like really focused on just the niche and only serving people with like relevant content and not going off path or anything. And now I'm kind of like, okay, I'm not going to go on, tangents about all this stuff, but I'm going to put those threads out there and let people pick them up, whenever they come across them and they relate to them. And somebody who doesn't relate to those, they'll just ignore them. It's like, it's, a single sentence that I say about like, whatever that I'm into, some obscure thing. And the person who does though, there's like a high upside to that they connect with that really deeply.
I'm so glad that the conversation went this way, Jeremy, because I think that this particular topic in this particular time in the social media world, I think that's the key. That is the key. Yep. It's those, I love how you said that. The more common threads you share with a client or listener, the stronger the connection, you know. And you know, you're seeing this manifest all over the internet. This is what I love. You love to see it. I don't know what to say. You love to see it. I love to see another dad out there. You know, I like Frisbee golf. So all you frolfers out there.
Oh yeah, me as well.
So, froth it up. I got a new best friend here.
There we go.
We got to froth it up. Yeah, man. So Jeremy, before we get into the rapid fire, why don't you tell everybody where we can find more Jeremy? Where can we find you, brother?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter, and I am Jeremy Enns. And then I've also got set up a page for everyone who's listening to this show. You can go to counterweightcreative.co/after-hours, all one word, and you can find all my links there, email address, anything like that. And I've got a bunch of free content, blog posts, workshops on podcast growth, on podcast sponsorships, a bunch of stuff. You can find that all there. And please do reach out, send me an email if you're into frolf, if you're into disc golf, ultimate frisbee, any of the obscure things that I've already mentioned so far. Please send me a message, and I'd love to connect.
Bada bing, bada boom. Links below, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Jeremy, let's get into the world famous rapid fire. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
It's not that serious, Charles. It's not that serious. Jeremy, what's the scariest movie you've ever seen?
So I hate scary movies. Actually, yeah, I don't know if I can even say I hate scary movies because I just like assume I hate them, so I refuse to watch them. So I can't even think of what comes to mind here. I might like my girlfriend loves horror movies and scary movies, and I'm like the exact opposite. So I might have to take a pass. I can't even think of like my scariest movie. Would anybody else would be like, that's not even in the category. That doesn't qualify. So I might have to take a pass on that one.
Come on, you gotta have something. You had to be scarred. Like, was it Willy Wonka? Is it Willy Wonka that got you?
Let's see.
That's a scary freaking movie.
That's the funny thing. Like, I don't think I was ever even scarred. I was just like, I don't think that's for me. I know I'm not gonna like it. I'm trying to think back to like childhood. What would it have been that would have scarred me? I can't even think of anything that comes to mind. I like. Let's just go with Willy Wonka. We're gonna maybe say that I just like buried the memory, and that was it early on, and it scarred me for life.
Yeah, I was definitely scarred, but I still enjoy horror movies, thankfully. Anyway, all right, moving on. If you could live anywhere in the world, Jeremy, where would you live?
So we were actually just in Berlin. We just got back from Berlin looking to make that our home base. But my partner, Kelly, just took a full-time job at a US-based startup, which does not really work with Berlin's visa system. So now we're actually in the process of looking to move to Lisbon, Portugal in the fall, which is a better visa process for us. Both of those cities high on my list. Berlin is one of my favorite places. The other one I would say would be Edinburgh, Scotland, probably.
Yeah, Scotland, beautiful. That's definitely somewhere I want to visit. Pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
It's been years since I've had it, but I do love it. I don't know why it's been years.
It's underrated. If you had the chance to go to space, would you go?
Oh, 100%.
If you had the chance to go to Mars, would you go?
How could I say no to, if I'm already in space, might as well go to Mars.
Okay, I dig it. If you had 10 seconds with yourself 10 years ago, what do you tell Jeremy?
I would say just keep going.
Keep going. Well, listen, Jeremy said it. I agree with it. I encourage everyone out there to keep on going. Jeremy, thanks for joining the show, brother.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. This has been great.
Wow, what an episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I really loved where the conversation actually started to go. It was just really cool, really free flowing. I feel like we could have chatted for a long time. And, you know, listen, by the way, there's no reason you need to be going into your business journey alone. I've got a great group of people just waiting for you. We just need you to get involved, join the mastermind, and start growing your business today. Your podcasting, your business, it doesn't need to be a solo episode. Join us. Get where you're going much faster. All right. Click the link below. Join the Podcast Savant Mastermind. I look forward to seeing you soon. Now it's up to you. Go take the action. I'll catch you next time. Peace.